The metal interior of the Sherman tank felt like the inside of a frozen tomb as Sergeant Michael O'Brien pressed his body against the turret wall at 2 in the morning, desperately trying to find a position where the sub-zero steel wouldn't leach the warmth from his bones through his sodden layers of wool, uniform and canvas field jacket that had long since lost any insulating value. Around him, wedged into the cramped interior of their 30-ton steel coffin, his 4-man crew huddled in impossible contortions that would have been merely uncomfortable in normal conditions, but became instruments of systematic torture when, combined with temperatures that had dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit and falling, their breath formed thick clouds of moisture that immediately condensed on every metal surface, creating a layer of ice crystals that accumulated throughout the night, dripping back onto their faces as freezing water when body heat occasionally melted small patches, their bodies shivering so violently and continuously that actual sleep became a biological impossibility despite exhaustion, so profound that O'Brien could barely remember his own name. It was December 18, 1944, 72 hours into the German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, and these American tank crews who had survived direct hits from German 88-meter anti-tank guns, who had fought through Panzerfaust ambushes and artillery barrages, who had endured the psychological horror of facing Tiger tanks that could destroy Shermans from ranges where American guns couldn't penetrate German armor, were discovering that winter itself might kill them before the enemy ever got another shot at their vulnerable vehicle. O'Brien's hands had lost feeling hours ago despite the wool gloves he wore inside leather shells. His feet were numb masses of pain inside boots that had seemed adequate in autumn, but became useless torture devices once temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there for days without relief. And his body had entered a state of continuous shivering that burned calories faster than the cold rations could replace them, creating a downward spiral of cold and exhaustion that he knew from medical training would eventually lead to hypothermia, impaired judgment and death if something didn't change soon. This moment represented something far more brutal than combat danger, more insidious than tactical challenges, more devastating to unit effectiveness than any German weapon system could achieve through direct action. These men were experiencing the forgotten agony of winter mechanized warfare, the systematic suffering that military historians rarely documented, that after-action reports barely mentioned, that official histories glossed over in favor of discussing tank battles and tactical maneuvers. They were learning that the very machines designed to protect them from enemy fire, the armored vehicles that were supposed to provide mobile firepower and battlefield survivability, had become instruments of continuous suffering that turned every night into a desperate struggle for survival against cold that could disable, maim, or kill just as efficiently as any German anti-tank weapon, and that did so with a relentless consistency that made combat almost seem preferable because at least combat eventually ended, while the cold never stopped, never relented, never gave them even a moment's respite from the biological crisis of trying to maintain human function inside a steel refrigerator that seemed specifically designed to extract every calorie of warmth from their bodies and radiate it uselessly into the frozen Belgian night. O'Brien had expected to face German Tiger tanks, Panther tanks with their sloped armor and deadly 75mm guns, artillery barrages that could turn entire grid squares into moonscapes of cratered earth, and Panzerfaust armed infantry waiting in ambush positions to destroy American armor at point-blank range when his unit deployed to Europe in autumn 1944, after months of stateside training that had emphasized gunnery, tactics, and crew coordination. What he hadn't expected, what no training manual had prepared him for, what no officer briefing had even mentioned as a significant concern, was that the simple biological necessity of sleeping in his Sherman tank during winter operations would become the most immediate, constant, and potentially lethal threat to his crew's combat effectiveness and actual survival, with frostbite cases, hypothermia evacuations, trench foot despite being tank-mounted rather than infantry, and various cold-related injuries disabling more American tankers in his battalion than German fire had managed during the same period of intense winter offensive operations. The suffering was so severe and so systematic that entire tank platoons became combat ineffective, not from battle damage that mechanics could repair, not from mechanical failures that maintenance crews could address, not from ammunition shortages or fuel problems that logistics could solve, but from the accumulated cold-related casualties that reduced 5-man crews to 3 or 4 effectives. And those remaining men were so exhausted from impossible sleeping conditions so impaired by chronic cold exposure, and so physically degraded by weeks of inadequate rest that they couldn't perform their duties at anything approaching normal standards. Crews became unable to operate equipment with necessary precision because their hands were too frozen to feel the controls they were manipulating, fingers too stiff to pull firing mechanisms or adjust sights with the fine motor control that accurate gunnery required. They couldn't load the main gun's 75-pound shells with proper speed because their bodies were too cold and stiff to maneuver effectively in the tight confines of the turret. Their movements clumsy and slow when combat situations demanded split-second reactions. They couldn't maintain proper situational awareness or make sound tactical decisions because sleep deprivation from impossible sleeping conditions had pushed them beyond the limits of human cognitive function, their brains operating in a fog of exhaustion that made even simple decisions difficult and complex tactical judgments nearly impossible. But this story isn't just about cold weather, the general hardships of winter military operations, or the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements that soldiers throughout history have endured during field campaigns. It's about the specific collision between industrial mechanized warfare's demands and fundamental human biological limits that couldn't be overcome through courage, discipline, or willpower. Where modern combat doctrine required soldiers to essentially live inside steel boxes that conducted freezing temperatures directly into their bodies with ruthless thermodynamic efficiency, where military planning at division and corps level casually assumed that tank crews could function continuously in conditions that caused systematic physiological breakdown if maintained for more than a few days, where tactical orders were written and issued by officers who had never spent a night in a frozen tank and genuinely didn't understand that the gap between engineering capabilities and human endurance had created a crisis of suffering that no tactical manual, no amount of training, no reservoir of courage or professional discipline could adequately address without fundamental changes to doctrine, equipment, or operational tempo. When American tank crews faced winter combat during the Battle of the Bulge and the subsequent Allied offensive operations through January and February 1945, they weren't just fighting the German Wehrmacht. They were simultaneously fighting their own equipment that had become an enemy to their survival, fighting their own body's biological limitations that couldn't be ignored or overcome through mental toughness alone, and fighting military systems and doctrines that had never adequately prepared for the fundamental reality that men needed sleep, needed warmth, needed basic human comfort to remain effective soldiers rather than frozen, exhausted casualties waiting to happen. The Sherman tanks that had been designed for battlefield mobility and mass production efficiency, that had been built to specific weight limits to allow for strategic transportation and bridge crossing, that prioritized armor protection and mechanical reliability over crew comfort because peacetime designers had never imagined that crews would need to live in these vehicles for weeks. At a time during sub-zero winter operations, had become steel coffins that slowly killed their occupants through systematic heat extraction, while simultaneously offering no alternative, because tactical situations required tanks to remain forward with frontline infantry, units that themselves had no heated shelters or rear area facilities where tank crews might find warmth and proper rest. The year was 1944, and the M4 Sherman tank represented one of the most successful examples of American industrial warfare capabilities and mass production philosophy that had transformed the United States into the arsenal of democracy, but its design revealed fundamental assumptions about armored warfare that would prove catastrophically inadequate when winter combat forced crews to essentially live inside vehicles that were never intended as habitation spaces. The Sherman's design philosophy prioritized battlefield mobility, mechanical reliability, ease of production, and armor protection within strict weight limits that allowed the 30-ton vehicle to cross European bridges and fit within shipping constraints for Atlantic transport. Interior space was ruthlessly optimized for combat operations, with every cubic foot allocated to ammunition storage, mechanical systems, armor protection, or the minimal room necessary for crew members to operate their stations during battle. The interior dimensions told the story of these priorities. Roughly 8 feet of usable width, 9 feet of length in the fighting compartment, with a turret basket that provided some organization but further restricted movement, and a hull front where driver and assistant driver occupied positions so cramped that even average-sized men found them confining during normal, Operations crew comfort had never been a design consideration, because peacetime military planning assumed that armored units would operate from established bases with proper maintenance, facilities and crew quarters, that tanks would return to rear areas after combat operations for servicing and crew rest, that extended field operations would be temporary situations, rather than the continuous frontline deployment that winter 1944-45 actually required. The Sherman had no heating system beyond whatever warmth might radiate, from the engine compartment through the bulkhead, into the crew areas. Minimal heat that provided slight relief during moderate weather but became utterly inadequate when temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there for days or weeks. The all-metal construction that provided armor protection also created perfect thermal conductivity that drew heat away from any warm surface that contacted it, including human bodies wrapped in whatever clothing they could layer together. Every surface inside the tank became a heat sink that actively worked to extract warmth from the crew, creating an environment where maintaining core body temperature became a continuous biological struggle that burned calories, generated fatigue, and ultimately led to the progressive cold injuries that disabled so many tankers during winter operations. Human biological needs, ignored during tank design because engineers were solving mechanical and tactical problems, rather than addressing human factors that wouldn't become military design priorities until decades later, created irreconcilable conflicts with the reality of winter armored operations. Human beings require approximately 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep per night to maintain cognitive function, physical coordination, and emotional stability necessary for effective combat performance. Body core temperature must remain above 95 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent hypothermia's progressive impairments that began with confusion and poor judgment, progressed to loss of fine motor control, and eventually led to unconsciousness and death if not corrected. Human bodies need space to stretch out during sleep, to change positions periodically, to avoid pressure points that cut off circulation, requirements that were biologically necessary rather than mere preferences for comfort. The physical impossibility of achieving comfortable rest in confined metal spaces became not just inconvenient, but actually dangerous when combined with cold, that made every attempt at sleep a test of survival, rather than recovery from exhaustion. The winter of 1944-45 in northwestern Europe brought some of the coldest temperatures in decades, with the Ardennes forest region, where the Battle of the Bulge erupted, experiencing sustained periods of sub-zero Fahrenheit temperatures, heavy snow that created mobility problems for armor, and the kind of penetrating cold that seemed to find every gap in clothing, every weakness in equipment, every vulnerability in human physiology. Battle of the Bulge temperatures regularly dropped to -10 or -15 degrees Fahrenheit during nighttime hours, with daytime highs barely reaching above freezing, even when sun appeared through the heavy cloud cover that characterized the region during December and January. The Ardennes terrain itself, heavily forested hills with limited road networks and few villages, meant that tanks often operated in isolated positions without access to buildings or shelters where crews might find warmth. Snow, ice, and the infamous Belgian mud created by freeze-thaw cycles made movement difficult and meant tanks frequently remained stationary for hours or days, unable to relocate to better positions and forced to endure whatever conditions existed at their current location. Tactical doctrine during this period required tanks to stay forward with infantry units to provide direct fire support, to serve as strong points in defensive positions, and to be immediately available for counterattacks or rapid response to German breakthroughs. This meant that the peacetime assumption of tanks returning to rear areas for maintenance and crew rest simply evaporated. Tanks stayed at the front continuously, sometimes for weeks without rotation to rear areas, because fluid combat situations and desperate tactical circumstances meant that every armored vehicle was needed on the line, regardless of crew condition. The doctrinal expectation was that crews would simply endure, that they would maintain combat effectiveness through professional discipline and mental toughness, that the exigencies of combat justified any level of hardship, because losing battles to German offensives would be worse than any amount of crew suffering from impossible living conditions. The sleeping reality inside a Sherman tank during winter operations was a geometric and thermodynamic nightmare that defeated every attempt to find adequate rest. 5 men, tank commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, needed to somehow sleep in a space originally designed to accommodate those same 5 men during combat operations when each had a specific station and wasn't trying to lie down or stretch out. The driver and assistant driver positions in the front hull were the most cramped, with barely enough room for a man to sit upright while operating controls, let alone recline or assume any position approaching comfortable rest. These crew members essentially had to sleep sitting up in their seats, or attempt to curl into impossible positions that provided no real rest. The turret crew, commander, gunner, and loader, had slightly more space in the turret basket and fighting compartment, but that space was cluttered with ammunition racks holding dozens of 75mm shells, machine gun ammunition, personal equipment, rations, and all the gear that 5 men accumulated during field operations. The ammunition storage alone consumed much of the theoretically usable space, with main gun rounds stored in racks along the turret walls and hull sides, taking up areas where a crew member might otherwise attempt to lie down. The turret floor provided the largest open area, but it was cluttered with spent shell casings after any combat action, covered in oil and grease from mechanical systems, and offered a surface roughly 6 feet by 4 feet that somehow needed to accommodate 3 men trying to sleep simultaneously, while a 4th remained on watch and a 5th tried to rest. In the driver's compartment, equipment competed for every inch: radios, periscopes, gun mechanisms, fire extinguishers, toolboxes, and countless other items all occupied space that crew members couldn't use for sleeping, but couldn't remove, because the equipment was essential for combat operations. The metal surfaces that surrounded crew members created the fundamental thermal problem that made sleep so difficult and dangerous. Metal at sub-zero temperatures became intensely cold to touch, cold enough to cause frostbite on exposed skin within seconds, cold enough that even insulated by multiple layers of wool clothing, a body pressed against metal would lose heat rapidly through conduction. Every position a crew member assumed for sleep meant some part of his body contacted freezing metal, leaning against the turret wall, resting on the turret floor, bracing against ammunition racks, and each contact point became a pathway for heat loss that his body had to compensate for by burning calories and generating warmth through shivering. The moisture from their breath accumulated as ice crystals on every metal surface, creating a coating of frost that would occasionally melt from body heat and drip freezing water back onto sleeping men, adding to the misery and further degrading whatever rest they might achieve. The comparison to other armies' experiences provided no comfort, because winter armor operations created universal suffering that affected all mechanized forces, regardless of nationality or equipment quality. German panzer crews faced nearly identical conditions in their tanks. Though some German armored vehicles had slightly better ventilation systems, and German winter uniforms were marginally superior to American issue clothing, Soviet tank crews actually faced worse conditions in many respects. With their T-34 tanks offering even less interior space and Soviet logistical systems providing less adequate cold weather gear, though Soviet operational doctrine involved shorter tactical engagement distances that sometimes meant better access to village shelters and buildings, British tank crews suffered through the same winter in their Cromwells and Churchills, discovering that British engineering had produced vehicles with identical human factors problems. The grim reality was that winter armored warfare was a universal nightmare that industrial-age militaries had simply failed to solve, creating conditions that every nation's tank crews endured while their respective armies learned through bitter experience that courage and discipline couldn't indefinitely overcome biology and thermodynamics. The initial deployment to the Ardennes region came in mid-December when Sergeant O'Brien's tank platoon moved forward to reinforce defensive positions along what intelligence had assured them was a quiet sector of the front, where German forces were considered depleted and unlikely to launch major offensives. The first night attempting to sleep in the Sherman came as a shock, even though autumn operations had already provided hints of what winter would bring. Temperatures that first night dropped to around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to be deeply uncomfortable, but not yet the life-threatening conditions that would come within days. O'Brien and his crew initially approached the sleeping problem with the optimism of men who had trained through difficult conditions and believed they could adapt to anything the situation demanded. They assumed they would be tired enough from combat operations that sleep would come, despite uncomfortable conditions, that their wool uniforms and field jackets would provide adequate insulation, and that they could develop some workable system for crew rest that would allow them to maintain combat effectiveness while getting the sleep their bodies required. The brutal reality revealed itself within the first few hours of that initial attempt at rest. O'Brien, as tank commander, initially tried to sleep in the turret with his upper body positioned near the commander's hatch, where he could quickly respond if the tank came under attack. His legs awkwardly bent because the turret space didn't allow him to stretch out fully. His body pressed against the turret wall because there was nowhere else to position himself. That didn't interfere with the gunner and loader who were attempting their own impossible sleeping positions. Within 20 minutes, the cold radiating through the metal turret wall had penetrated his wool uniform and field jacket, creating a line of icy chill along his entire right side that no amount of repositioning could eliminate, because every direction meant contact with equally cold metal surfaces. His breath formed clouds of vapor that immediately condensed on the cold metal above him, creating a layer of frost that periodically dripped freezing water onto his face. When slight temperature variations caused melting, the shivering started almost immediately. Uncontrollable muscle contractions that his body employed to generate heat, burning calories and creating fatigue while simultaneously making actual sleep impossible, because the violent shaking prevented the relaxation necessary for rest. The loader, Private First Class Danny Martinez from Texas, attempted to curl up on the turret floor where theoretically the largest open space existed, but discovered that the floor was littered with equipment that couldn't be moved, that the metal floor conducted cold even more efficiently than the walls, and that the spent shell casings from that day's combat action created uncomfortable pressure points that dug into his body no matter how he positioned himself. Martinez tried using his bedroll as insulation between his body and the metal floor, but the thin canvas and wool provided minimal protection against the cold that seemed to actively pull warmth from his body through any surface contact. He attempted to curl into a fetal position to minimize his surface area and conserve heat, but the cramped space meant his curled position forced his knees against one metal surface and his shoulders against another, creating multiple points where cold conducted directly into his body. Within an hour, Martinez was shivering so violently that his teeth chattered audibly, the sound echoing in the metal confines of the turret and keeping other crew members awake, even if they had been capable of sleeping themselves. The gunner, Corporal James Wilson from Ohio, wedged himself between the main gun mechanism and the turret wall, in a position that was technically sitting rather than lying down, but which he hoped might allow some rest, even if not proper sleep. Wilson discovered that this position, while marginally less uncomfortable than lying on the frozen floor, created its own problems as the metal gun mechanism conducted cold directly into his back, while the turret wall froze his shoulder and arm on the opposite side. His legs, bent awkwardly to fit in the available space, began losing sensation within 30 minutes as circulation was restricted by the unnatural position and the cold. He tried to shift positions periodically to restore blood flow and prevent his legs from completely going numb. But every movement disturbed other crew members in the cramped space and made their own difficult sleeping attempts even harder. The wool uniform that had seemed adequately warm during daylight operations proved completely inadequate for extended periods of immobility in sub-zero temperatures, the fabric becoming damp from his breath and body moisture, then starting to freeze in a process that transformed his clothing from insulation into a cold, clammy layer that seemed to actively work against his body's attempts to maintain warmth. In the driver's compartment, Corporal Robert Chen from California faced perhaps the worst conditions of any crew position because the hull front offered even less space than the turret and absolutely no possibility of assuming anything. Approaching a horizontal sleeping position, Chen tried to sleep sitting in his driver's seat, his head leaning against the cold metal hatch above him. His body twisted awkwardly to fit in a space designed for vehicle operation rather than rest. The driver's position, with its limited visibility ports and cramped dimensions, became a claustrophobic nightmare when trying to sleep there. The metal surfaces surrounding him on all sides conducting cold that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. His feet, stuffed into combat boots that had become damp during the day's operations, began losing feeling almost immediately as the boots froze and circulation was restricted by his sitting position. Chen tried removing his boots to improve circulation, but his feet immediately became painfully cold, forcing him to put the boots back on even though the damp, freezing leather was only marginally better than bare feet in the sub-zero temperature. The assistant driver, Private Tommy O'Connor from Massachusetts, theoretically had the best sleeping position, because folklore among tank crews held that the assistant driver's station offered the most space and the best chance at rest. O'Connor discovered that this supposed advantage was mythical. While he had marginally more room than the driver, he still couldn't lie flat or assume any natural sleeping position, and his spot in the hull front was actually colder than the turret, because of its proximity to the glacis plate that was directly exposed to outside temperatures and wind. He tried every conceivable position, sitting upright, leaning sideways, attempting to curl up in the footwell, but each position proved unsustainable for more than 20 or 30 minutes before cold or discomfort forced him to shift again. The constant movement meant he never achieved even light sleep, instead spending the entire night in a twilight state of semi-consciousness where exhaustion fought against cold and discomfort in a battle that exhaustion was steadily losing. By approximately 2 in the morning, 6 hours after the crew had first attempted to sleep, not one man had achieved more than a few scattered minutes of actual rest. The shivering had become so violent and continuous that it burned calories faster than their cold rations could replace, creating a vicious cycle where their bodies consumed energy trying to stay warm, which made them even more susceptible to cold, which increased the shivering, which burned more energy in an escalating spiral toward hypothermia. O'Brien, checking on his crew, discovered that Martinez's hands had become so cold that he couldn't feel his fingers, that Wilson's feet had gone completely numb despite his boots, that Chen was showing early signs of hypothermia with slurred speech and confusion, and that O'Connor was shivering so violently that he had bitten his tongue during an involuntary muscle spasm. The tank commander made the decision to attempt running the engine for warmth, knowing this violated tactical doctrine because the engine noise would reveal their position to any German forces in the area, and the exhaust would create a heat signature, visible to enemy observers with infrared detection equipment. The engine warmth, when they ran it for 20 minutes, provided temporary relief that was almost worse than the cold because it raised hope that conditions might improve, only to have the cold return even more aggressively when they shut down the engine to maintain tactical security. The cycle of running the engine, warming slightly, then shutting down and experiencing the return of brutal cold created a psychological torture that added to the physical suffering. The moisture from their breath and bodies, which had been forming ice crystals on the metal surfaces, partially melted during the engine running, creating condensation that then froze when the engine shut down, coating every surface with a layer of ice that made conditions even worse than before. The crew rotation attempted during that first night, with one man staying awake on watch while 4 tried to sleep, meant that no one got more than 2 hours of even attempted rest, and those 2 hours were so disrupted by cold and discomfort that they provided almost no recovery from the day's exhaustion. By dawn of the second day, when German artillery began the preparatory bombardment that signaled the start of the Battle of the Bulge offensive, O'Brien's crew was already operating at diminished capacity from a single night of failed rest. They could still perform their basic functions. Driver could operate the tank, gunner could engage targets, loader could handle ammunition, but their reaction times were slightly slower, their judgment marginally impaired, their coordination fractionally reduced. These small decrements weren't immediately obvious or disabling, but O'Brien recognized from his training that they represented the beginning of a degradation curve that would accelerate dramatically if crew rest didn't improve. The problem was that the second night would be even worse than the first because they would be starting from a baseline of existing exhaustion rather than relative freshness, and conditions were deteriorating as temperatures dropped even further, and tactical situations made any alternative sleeping arrangements impossible. The second night brought temperatures near 0 Fahrenheit, and the added stress of knowing they were now in active combat with German forces attacking all along the front. The crew attempted the same sleeping arrangements, but exhaustion made everything worse. Bodies that were already cold and tired had even less resilience against the brutal conditions. Minds that were already foggy from sleep deprivation had more difficulty maintaining the mental discipline necessary to endure the suffering, and the knowledge that they faced indefinite continuation of these conditions created psychological stress that compounded the physical crisis. Martinez developed frostbite on 3 toes during the second night, though he wouldn't report it until days later when the injury had progressed to the point where he couldn't effectively perform his duties. Wilson began experiencing hallucinations around 4 in the morning, seeing movement in the tank that wasn't there, hearing voices that didn't exist, classic symptoms of severe sleep deprivation that terrified him more than German tanks because hallucinations suggested his mind was breaking under conditions his body couldn't sustain. By the third night, the crew had reached a state of crisis that threatened their combat effectiveness and their survival more immediately than any German weapon system. They had collectively accumulated perhaps 6 hours of actual sleep across 3 days, 2 hours per man, scattered in 15-minute intervals that provided no REM sleep, no deep rest, no real recovery from exhaustion. O'Brien himself was experiencing double vision, difficulty focusing his eyes and reaction times that he knew had slowed to dangerous levels. Chen, the driver, made 3 navigation errors during the day's movement that he would never have made under normal circumstances, mistakes that fortunately didn't result in vehicle loss but easily could have driven them into German positions or impassable terrain. The loader, Martinez, dropped an ammunition round while loading the main gun during a brief engagement, a mistake that could have jammed the gun or injured crew members, caused by hands that were too cold and coordination that was too impaired to safely handle the 70-pound shells. The crisis point came on the 4th night when O'Connor, the assistant driver, developed symptoms of moderate hypothermia despite being inside the tank. His core body temperature had dropped to approximately 94 degrees Fahrenheit, causing confusion, slurred speech, and dangerous impairment of judgment that made him a liability rather than an asset to the crew. O'Brien faced the impossible decision of whether to evacuate O'Connor for medical treatment, which would reduce the crew to 4 men and leave critical positions undermanned, or try to warm him up and keep him with the tank, risking that his condition would deteriorate further and potentially cost him his life. The crew spent that night running the engine almost continuously despite tactical risks, clustering around O'Connor to share body warmth, and essentially abandoning any pretense of rest or tactical readiness in favor of the emergency medical situation that Winter had created inside their supposedly protective armored vehicle. By dawn of the 5th day, with O'Connor's condition stabilized but still worrying, with every crew member showing signs of cold injury and severe exhaustion, with combat effectiveness degraded to perhaps 50% of normal capability, O'Brien recognized that they were approaching the breaking point where the tank would become combat ineffective, not from battle damage but from the systematic destruction of crew capability that 5 nights of Winter sleeping in a frozen steel box had accomplished more thoroughly than any German attack. As the Battle of the Bulge entered its 2nd week and O'Brien's crew struggled through their 8th consecutive night of failed sleep attempts in the frozen Sherman, the systematic nature of the crisis became undeniable, not just to the crews suffering through it, but to the officers and commanders who were finally beginning to understand that their tactical planning had collided with biological reality in ways that no amount of discipline or courage could overcome. The realization came gradually through multiple channels. Medical officers reporting unprecedented numbers of cold injury evacuations from armored units, maintenance officers noting that tank crews were making basic operational errors that suggested severe cognitive impairment, and tactical commanders discovering that their most experienced crews were performing at levels barely above replacement crews fresh from training because exhaustion had erased the advantages that experience normally provided. Sergeant O'Brien, documenting conditions in the informal journal he kept despite regulations against written records that might provide intelligence to the enemy, wrote on December 26th that his crew had collectively achieved perhaps 12 hours of sleep across the previous 8 days, an average of 90 minutes per man per day, a level of deprivation that medical training told him would cause hallucinations, impaired judgment, and eventually complete psychological breakdown if sustained. Much longer, the military doctrine failure became apparent to anyone willing to acknowledge it. The fundamental assumption underlying American armored operations was that tanks would operate from established rear areas with maintenance facilities and proper crew quarters, that combat operations would be followed by rotation to these rear positions for servicing and rest, that extended field deployments would be exceptional situations rather than the continuous frontline presence that winter combat actually demanded. This assumption, built into training programs and tactical planning at every level from battalion to army group, had simply evaporated when German offensives and subsequent Allied counterattacks created fluid combat situations where every available tank needed to remain on the front line regardless of crew condition, because tactical situations were too desperate to allow the luxury of rotating units for rest. The tank maintenance schedule assumed regular intervals when vehicles could be pulled back for service. But that schedule had implicitly included crew rest periods that tactical reality no longer permitted. The result was a doctrinal system that had effectively sacrificed crew welfare for tactical availability, without anyone consciously making that decision, or acknowledging that the sacrifice was happening, until cold weather made the consequences impossible to ignore. The engineering versus biology conflict represented a fundamental tension that peacetime tank designers had never adequately addressed, because they were solving mechanical and tactical problems within weight and cost constraints, while human factors, engineering remained an undeveloped military science that wouldn't receive serious attention until decades later. The Sherman tank was an engineering marvel for its intended purpose. It was reliable, producible in massive quantities, maintainable with relatively simple tools, and effective in combat within the limits of its armor and armament. But it was a biological nightmare for human habitation, because every design decision had prioritized combat performance over crew comfort, assuming that comfort was a luxury that could be sacrificed while ignoring the reality that crew effectiveness ultimately depended on biological factors like sleep, warmth, and basic physical welfare that couldn't be indefinitely compromised without catastrophic performance degradation. The fundamental incompatibility between a steel box optimized for armor protection and mechanical reliability versus the thermal regulation needs of human bodies designed to maintain 98.6-degree core temperatures meant that the winning tank design from an engineering perspective had created conditions that systematically destroyed the biological systems necessary for crew effectiveness. The impossible mathematics of the situation became clear to O'Brien as he tried to develop any workable solution within the constraints that tactical reality imposed. 5 men needed approximately 7 hours of sleep per night to maintain cognitive function, meaning the crew collectively needed 35 man-hours of sleep per day. The tank required 24-hour manning because German attacks could come at any time, and response time measured in seconds could determine survival. Even with aggressive crew rotation where only 1 man maintained watch while 4 slept, the maximum sleep time available per man was approximately 6 hours if distributed perfectly. But the cramped space meant that men couldn't actually sleep simultaneously because there wasn't room for 4 men to lie down at once, reducing practical maximum sleep to perhaps 3 or 4 hours per man under ideal conditions. But conditions were never ideal. Combat operations interrupted sleep attempts, cold prevented actual rest during designated sleep periods, and the physical impossibility of comfortable positioning meant that even time allocated for sleep didn't translate into actual recovery. The mathematical equation had no solution within the physical and tactical constraints that defined the situation, meaning that continued operations guaranteed progressive crew degradation, regardless of how cleverly they tried to manage the impossible situation. The comparative suffering experienced by other armies provided cold comfort, because the realization that German, Soviet, and British tank crews faced identical or worse conditions only confirmed that winter armored warfare represented an unsolved problem that all industrial militaries had simply failed to address adequately. Intelligence reports from interrogated German prisoners revealed that panzer crews were experiencing the same crisis: frostbite casualties, exhaustion-related performance degradation, and the same impossible sleeping conditions that American crews endured. Soviet tank crews, according to liaison officers, faced perhaps even worse conditions in their T-34 tanks that offered less interior volume and cruder environmental protection, though Soviet doctrine's emphasis on shorter tactical movements sometimes provided better access to village shelters where crews could find warmth between engagements. British tank crews in Cromwell and Churchill tanks were filing similar reports of cold injuries and exhaustion casualties that suggested the problem was universal rather than specific to American equipment or doctrine. The grim realization was that industrial-age armies had successfully mechanized firepower and mobility, but had completely failed to mechanize the basic human welfare systems necessary to keep the men operating those machines functional for extended periods under extreme environmental conditions. The command-understanding gap became increasingly obvious and frustrating as O'Brien and other tank commanders tried to communicate the severity of the crisis to higher headquarters, who remained insulated from the conditions by heated command posts, proper sleeping facilities, and regular hot meals that made the frontline experience seem comprehensible when it was actually beyond the experiential understanding of people who hadn't spent nights in frozen tanks. Battalion commanders who visited forward positions during daylight hours could see that crews were cold and tired, but they couldn't truly grasp the cumulative effect of weeks without proper sleep, couldn't understand how continuous cold exposure created progressive physical breakdown that didn't immediately disable but steadily degraded capability below acceptable levels. Tactical orders continued to assume crew effectiveness that simply didn't exist. Operational plans called for rapid movement and complex maneuvers that exhausted frozen crews couldn't execute with the precision that planning assumed. The disconnect between what higher headquarters believed was possible and what actual crew capability allowed created a gap where units consistently underperformed expectations, not through lack of courage or effort, but through biological impairment that tactical planning refused to adequately acknowledge. The adaptation attempts that crews developed represented desperate improvisations born from necessity rather than sanctioned solutions, each offering marginal improvements while creating new risks that made the choices between bad options rather than discovering good ones. Some crews developed elaborate sleeping rotations where positions were assigned by seniority. Commander got first choice of sleeping location, then gunner, then loader, with driver and assistant driver relegated to their stations not because those positions offered adequate rest but because someone had to occupy them, and junior men got the worst assignments. Other crews experimented with pooling their bedrolls and blankets to create a communal sleeping area on the turret floor, where 2 men could sleep in relative warmth while 3 maintained watch, rotating every 2 hours so that everyone got 4 hours of marginally better sleep rather than 6 hours of impossible conditions. Scavenging operations became routine as crews collected any material that might provide insulation. German blankets stripped from abandoned positions, hay or straw stolen from barns, cardboard from ration boxes, even newspapers stuffed inside. Uniforms for extra insulation despite the fire hazard this created. The most desperate crews learned to maximize engine warmth by developing techniques for running engines just long enough to raise interior temperatures, without staying on long enough to completely give away their positions. 20 minutes of running followed by 40 minutes of shutdown became a common pattern that violated tactical doctrine, but provided just enough warmth to prevent hypothermia while theoretically maintaining some operational security. Some crews jury-rigged ventilation systems to direct engine exhaust warmth into the crew compartment, creating carbon monoxide risks that had to be carefully managed, but providing marginally better heating than passive radiation through the engine bulkhead. The sharing of body heat, traditionally avoided by American soldiers who valued personal space and whose culture didn't embrace physical closeness between men, became accepted necessity as crews learned that clustering together provided survival advantage that outweighed cultural preferences or concerns about appearing weak or overly intimate. The psychological impact of knowing that every night would bring the same suffering created a dread that compounded the physical exhaustion and made the overall burden even harder to bear. O'Brien found himself starting to fear nightfall hours before sunset. The knowledge that another night of failed sleep attempts awaited creating anxiety that made it even harder to relax when sleep opportunity finally came. The sleep deprivation's mental effects, irritability, emotional volatility, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, compounded the stress of combat operations and created interpersonal conflicts within crews that had previously worked smoothly together. Martinez and Wilson nearly came to blows on the 7th night over a trivial disagreement about sleeping positions, an argument that never would have escalated under normal circumstances, but which exhaustion transformed into genuine hostility that O'Brien had to actively suppress to maintain crew cohesion. The psychological wear of never having rest, never having comfort, never having relief from the grinding misery of cold, created a mental burden that was perhaps as damaging as the physical suffering. The supply chain failures added insult to injury as crews discovered that the winter equipment promised by supply officers rarely materialized in forms that actually addressed their needs. Winter sleeping bags arrived eventually, but they were designed for ground use by infantry and were completely useless in the confined spaces of tank interiors where there was no room to properly deploy them and where their bulk made movement impossible. Portable heaters appeared in supply depots but were allocated to infantry units in frozen foxholes, rather than tank crews whose officers assumed the tanks themselves provided adequate shelter. Arctic parkas and insulated boots eventually reached the front lines but in quantities insufficient to equip entire crews, creating resentment and difficult decisions about which crew members got the limited cold weather gear. The gap between what regulations said troops should have and what actually reached frontline units meant that crews faced winter with equipment designed for moderate weather, forcing them to improvise solutions that were never adequate but were the only options available. The brutal calculation that crews began making revealed how desperate the situation had become. Men were mentally weighing whether the risk of German fire justified sleeping outside the tank where cold air might be more bearable than frozen metal, whether running engines for warmth was worth the tactical risk of giving away positions, whether combat effectiveness had degraded so much that crew survival had to take priority over mission accomplishment. O'Brien himself admitted in his journal that he had begun to wonder whether frostbite evacuation might be preferable to continued operations, a thought that horrified him when he recognized he was considering self-injury as escape from conditions that had become unbearable. The fact that experienced, dedicated soldiers were having these thoughts revealed how completely the winter sleeping crisis had broken through normal military discipline and professional commitment to expose the raw biological reality that humans had limits that couldn't be exceeded indefinitely regardless of tactical necessity or operational requirements. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge and throughout the final months of the European campaign, something remarkable began happening across American armored units as crews, commanders, and support personnel recognized that the winter sleeping crisis had revealed fundamental problems, requiring systematic solutions rather than simply enduring until weather improved. Sergeant O'Brien's battalion, like many armored units that had survived the winter offensive, started implementing field modifications to their Sherman tanks that represented unauthorized but necessary adaptations to address crew welfare issues that official channels had failed to solve. Maintenance crews began installing improvised heating systems using salvaged German equipment, captured stoves, and creative metalwork that violated technical manuals but provided marginally better crew compartment temperatures. Some units cut ventilation holes to improve air circulation while minimizing drafts, installed insulation materials scavenged from destroyed buildings, and fabricated interior padding that provided minimal but meaningful protection from direct contact with frozen metal surfaces that had caused so many cold injuries. The changed tactical doctrines that emerged from winter experience represented harder-won lessons about the biological limits that constrained mechanized operations regardless of strategic objectives, or tactical advantages that continuous forward deployment might offer. Battalion and division commanders who had witnessed entire platoons becoming combat ineffective from exhaustion and cold injuries began implementing mandatory crew rotation policies that pulled tanks back to rear areas for 24 to 48-hour rest periods, regardless of tactical situations, accepting the temporary reduction in frontline strength as necessary investment in maintaining long-term unit effectiveness. The recognition that exhausted, frozen crews performed so poorly that their presence often created more risk than value, through friendly fire incidents, navigation errors, and mechanical mistakes that disabled vehicles, gradually convinced even reluctant commanders that crew welfare wasn't a luxury, but a tactical necessity that had to be balanced against operational requirements. Forward supply points began establishing heated tents or commandeering buildings specifically as crew rest facilities, where tankers could sleep in warmth, dry their clothing, and recover from accumulated exhaustion before returning to their vehicles. Medical protocols evolved rapidly as combat medics and battalion surgeons documented the specific patterns of cold injuries affecting tank crews and developed treatment approaches tailored to the unique problems of armored warfare in winter conditions. The recognition that frostbite in tank crews typically affected extremities exposed during operations, but also caused unusual injuries to areas pressed against frozen metal during sleep attempts led to specific preventive guidance about insulation placement and sleeping positions. Medical officers began routine cold injury screening for tank crews similar to combat stress evaluations, recognizing that progressive cold exposure created cumulative damage that needed intervention before reaching crisis levels that required evacuation. The statistical documentation of cold injury rates rivaling combat wounds in some armored units provided quantitative evidence that finally convinced higher headquarters that crew environmental conditions represented genuine operational problems requiring resources and attention rather than merely issues of soldier toughness or unit discipline. The post-war assessment conducted by the Army's Armored Board and various tactical analysis units produced extensive documentation of winter 1944-45 experiences that would influence armored vehicle design and doctrine for decades. After-action reports from battalion and division level contained unprecedented detail about crew welfare issues, with specific recommendations that crew heating systems, improved sleeping arrangements, and mandatory rest rotations needed to be integrated into armored doctrine, rather than treated as comfort issues subordinate to tactical considerations. The medical statistics were particularly damning. In some armored divisions, cold weather injuries and exhaustion-related casualties during December 1944 through February 1945 exceeded battle casualties during the same period, providing irrefutable evidence that environmental conditions had created a crisis affecting combat power more significantly than German weapons. The command recognition that winning winter battles required solving human problems as much as tactical ones represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached mechanized warfare and crew welfare. The design changes that appeared in post-war American armored vehicles reflected lessons that had been purchased at terrible cost and crew suffering during that winter of 1944-45. The tanks developed during the late 1940s and deployed during the Korean War incorporated crew heating systems as standard equipment rather than afterthoughts, with designs that provided actual temperature control rather than hoping engine warmth would suffice. Interior layouts began accounting for crew rest requirements, with modest improvements in space allocation and the recognition that men needed room to sleep, even if vehicles were primarily combat platforms. The slow integration of human factors engineering into military vehicle design, considering ergonomics, environmental controls, and crew welfare alongside traditional priorities of firepower and armor, represented a philosophical shift away from the assumption that soldiers were infinitely adaptable machines who could function in any conditions toward recognition that human biological limits constrained what mechanized forces could actually accomplish. The Korean War experience, where American tank crews faced another winter campaign, showed measurable improvements in cold weather performance and significantly reduced non-battle casualty rates compared to World War II, validating that the lessons learned at such cost in Belgium had been successfully integrated into equipment and doctrine. The doctrinal evolution continued through the Cold War period as the Army established formal cold weather warfare training programs that systematically addressed the human factors issues that World War II had revealed through brutal experience. The Arctic Test Center and various cold weather training facilities developed specific doctrine for winter armored operations that explicitly incorporated crew rest requirements, environmental protection measures, and operational tempo limitations based on human endurance, rather than assuming crews could maintain indefinite operations regardless of conditions. The development of proper winter clothing systems for armored crews, insulated coveralls, thermal boots designed for cramped vehicle interiors, cold weather sleeping bags that actually fit tank crew stations, showed that the military had finally accepted that soldier welfare required specific equipment solutions, rather than expecting men to make do with inadequate gear. The systematic training in managing human factors during winter operations, including instruction on recognizing cold injury symptoms, implementing crew rotation schedules, and balancing tactical requirements against biological limitations, demonstrated that the informal adaptations that crews like O'Brien's had developed through desperate improvisation had been formalized into doctrine that future generations would learn before facing combat rather than discovering through suffering. The veteran testimony that emerged over decades following the war gradually brought public and historical recognition to aspects of winter armored warfare that official histories had largely glossed over in favor of discussing tank battles and tactical maneuvers. O'Brien himself became active in veteran organizations and historical preservation efforts, giving detailed accounts of sleeping conditions in winter Shermans that shocked audiences who had assumed that tank crews enjoyed relative comfort and protection compared to infantry and frozen foxholes. His presentations at military history conferences and contributions to oral history projects helped document that the greatest challenge of winter, 1944-45, often wasn't defeating German tanks but simply maintaining human function in machines that had become instruments of systematic suffering. Other veterans like Martinez, who eventually lost 2 toes to frostbite sustained during those December nights in Belgium, spoke publicly about the long-term impacts of cold injuries and the inadequacy of recognition systems that awarded Purple Hearts for enemy-inflicted wounds but provided no comparable acknowledgement for injuries caused by equipment inadequacies and doctrinal failures that were just as disabling and resulted from service under conditions that went beyond normal expectations of military hardship. The modern military's integration of these lessons became evident in contemporary armored vehicle designs, where environmental control systems are standard features, where crew ergonomics receive serious engineering attention, and where the understanding that soldier effectiveness depends on basic biological welfare has become foundational rather than controversial. The M1 Abrams tank and other modern armored vehicles incorporate heating and cooling systems, crew stations designed for sustained operations including rest provisions, and recognition that the interface between human operators and mechanical systems requires careful design to maintain long-term effectiveness rather than assuming that discipline and courage can compensate for inadequate equipment. The historical recognition that O'Brien's generation purchased through their suffering, that winning wars requires keeping soldiers functional, that machines must serve human needs even while humans operate those machines, and that biological limits define what's actually achievable regardless of what tactical planning assumes, has become so integrated into modern military thinking that it's easy to forget how recently and at what cost these lessons were learned by men who shivered through winter nights in frozen tanks while fighting a war that depended on their effectiveness but had failed to provide conditions where effectiveness could be sustained. The frozen steel of that Sherman tank turret may have warmed with spring's arrival in 1945, and the Ardennes forest may have long since recovered from the devastation of winter warfare. But the lesson learned during those brutal nights when Sergeant Michael O'Brien and thousands of other tank crews shivered through impossible sleeping conditions remains as relevant today as it was in December 1944, standing watch in that cramped metal box at 2 in the morning while his crew struggled futilely to find rest against sub-zero steel surfaces. O'Brien had witnessed more than the physical suffering of cold and exhaustion. He had seen the collision between industrial warfare's demands and human biological limits that couldn't be overcome through courage or discipline alone, had experienced firsthand how the machines designed to provide battlefield advantage could simultaneously wage war against their own operators, and had learned that true military effectiveness required recognizing that soldiers were flesh and blood, humans with genuine needs for warmth, sleep, and basic comfort that tactical doctrine ignored at the cost of combat power itself. The transformation that began with tank crews' winter suffering would ultimately reshape how modern militaries understand the relationship between equipment design, human factors, and operational effectiveness in ways that extended far beyond simply adding heaters to armored vehicles. The recognition that crew welfare wasn't a luxury, subordinate to tactical considerations but rather a fundamental requirement for maintaining combat effectiveness challenged traditional military thinking that had assumed soldiers could function indefinitely in any conditions, if properly motivated and disciplined. The former tankers who had endured winter 1944-45 became advocates for systematic attention to human factors in military equipment design, for doctrines that acknowledged biological limits rather than pretending they didn't exist, and for the principle that armies that maintained their soldiers' basic welfare would ultimately prove more effective than those that sacrificed human needs for marginal tactical advantages. They understood in ways that peacetime planners and academic theorists could not, that the gap between what commanders could order and what human bodies could actually sustain often determined the outcome of campaigns more surely than tactics or technology, and that failing to address that gap meant wasting combat power through preventable casualties that served no strategic purpose. The strategic lesson of winter tank sleeping conditions that true military power depends on maintaining soldiers as functional human beings rather than treating them as infinitely resilient mechanical components. That equipment must serve human needs even while humans operate that equipment, and that biological limits define what's actually achievable regardless of tactical planning assumptions, became a guiding principle for post-war military development and the evolution of doctrines that finally acknowledged what frontline soldiers had always known but higher headquarters had been slow to accept. The same recognition that led to heated crew compartments and mandatory rest rotations also influenced broader military thinking about operational tempo, unit sustainability, and the relationship between soldier welfare and combat effectiveness that would define modern professional militaries' approaches to maintaining forces capable of sustained operations, rather than brief campaigns that burn through personnel faster than they accomplish strategic objectives. But perhaps the most profound legacy of those frozen nights in Sherman tanks lies in their demonstration of how easily military systems can create suffering that serves no purpose, how doctrines developed in peacetime can fail catastrophically when confronted with realities that planning never anticipated, and how the gap between what appears feasible on maps in heated headquarters versus what's actually survivable in the field can grow so large that courage and professionalism cannot bridge it indefinitely. The tank crews who discovered that their protective steel shelters had become frozen torture. Chambers learned that modern warfare's greatest challenges weren't always tactical or strategic, but could be as fundamental as the biological impossibility of sleeping in sub-zero temperatures without adequate protection, and that addressing these challenges required acknowledging them rather than assuming that good soldiers would simply endure whatever conditions their missions demanded regardless of the human cost or the degradation of capability that resulted from systematic suffering. True military effectiveness in the contemporary world comes not from the ability to push soldiers beyond human limits through force of will or threat of discipline, but from the wisdom to recognize those limits, design around them, and create conditions where human performance can be sustained rather than progressively destroyed by the very systems meant to enable combat power. The armies that thrive are those that have learned to embrace the principles that Winter 1944-45 taught so brutally, that soldiers' biological needs are tactical factors requiring the same careful planning as ammunition supply or maintenance schedules. That equipment must be designed for the humans who operate it, rather than expecting humans to adapt to equipment that systematically impairs their function, and that winning wars requires keeping soldiers capable of fighting rather than assuming that motivation and discipline can compensate indefinitely for conditions that cause systematic breakdown of human capability. In the end, the tank crews who shivered through impossible nights in frozen Shermans discovered something more valuable than any tactical lesson about armored warfare. They discovered that the true measure of military power wasn't found in the specifications of weapons or the cleverness of tactics, but in the systematic attention to the fundamental human realities that determined whether soldiers could actually execute what doctrine assumed they would accomplish. The frozen steel had taught a lesson about the gap between industrial capability and biological endurance, between what engineers could build and what humans could survive operating, between the missions that commanders ordered and the conditions that made those missions achievable or impossible. The war was won despite rather than because of the winter sleeping conditions. But the real victory, the recognition that military effectiveness ultimately depended on maintaining soldiers as functional humans rather than consuming them as expendable resources, that equipment must serve those who operate it rather than the reverse, and that the armies that care for their soldiers prove more effective than those that merely drive them was just beginning to reshape how modern militaries would understand that true strength comes not from the hardness of steel, but from the sustainability of the humans who make that steel effective in accomplishing missions that require not just courage and skill, but also the basic biological capacity to function that can only be maintained when military systems finally acknowledge that soldiers are human beings with real limits that doctrine and equipment must respect rather than ignore.